Okay, hello and welcome to round 5 of the US Amateur Team East. As we saw in the first 4 videos, we were entering this round with a team score of 3.5 out of 4. So a decent score, not a perfect one, so we probably weren't contesting for winning the tournament at this point, but still very much alive for some of the top places. And I individually had a perfect score of 4 out of 4, which I was very happy with. Obviously, always going to be very happy with a perfect score. But I was also very happy with the way that I got there. I felt that my play had been quite reasonable coming into this game. All 4 games I thought were relatively smooth. The first game was definitely the most questionable, since I had a pretty bad position out of the opening and had to recover. But it was really only for a move or two, and pretty much everything else I thought had gone quite well for me throughout this event. So I was pretty confident going into this critical 5th round, where we had by far our strongest opposition of the event, with only 2 rounds remaining and being on a very, very high board, competing for the top places. All of the teams left were going to be very, very strong, and this one was no exception. I individually was playing against a very young player, Kieran Nasta. We played in a rapid game recently at the Marshall Chess Club, and although I did end up winning the game, it was not a very convincing victory at all. Very much passing through. If I don't remember exactly the game, but I do remember it was involved passing through multiple very, very questionable positions en route to what ended up being a full point. So I was definitely aware going into this round that my opponent was very strong, improving rapidly, and he had already proven, not that he necessarily needed to, but he had already himself personally proven that he was very, very capable of beating me. So with the black pieces against such a player, the situation is very similar to the opening discussion I was talking about in game 1, where against much lower rated players, you often choose to just play the main line, trust that your theoretical knowledge is going to be better than theirs. But against people who are slightly lower rated and are going to try to beat you, like my opponent, or like my opponent theoretically would be, you often choose a slightly offbeat line, something that's sound but not one of the top tier openings, in an effort to get like a position where your opponent is going to press, obviously because they're better, but your position is resilient enough that they may end up overpressing. And so in the first game, we chose the Pyrrhic defense, which is one of the classical ways to try to play for a win with the black pieces along those lines. But it is a very, very risky opening because that is truly a objectively pretty bad opening. And so in this game, I chose the one of the other ways that black often plays for a win with the black pieces, which is to enter the classical Sicilian. This is mostly an old line. The classical Sicilian, as the name suggests, was one of the first approaches to the Sicilian, and a very logical one. You simply put both of your knights in the center, where they will exert serious pressure in the center. You rapidly develop, and so you might wonder why this line fell out of favor, and it's largely for concrete reasons. The knight Orff variation with a6 has become very popular because often the knight actually would prefer to go to d7. So committing it to going to c6 as early as move 5 is sometimes premature. The dragon variation is mostly refuted in sort of the modern era, but for a very long time it was quite popular as well, trying to fan shadow the bishop and again defer the decision of where to put the knight. Could either go to c6 or could go to c5. But the classical Sicilian was never refuted. It just leads to a bit of a passive position in the main lines after bishop to g5. So a typical main line here continues e6, queen d2. We saw this from the white side in our round 7 game of the Blitzfield Invitational. So I think I talked a bit more about the opening there if you want to know some of the details, but just very briefly. Black often plays a6 to prevent any knight b5 stuff and pressure on d6. And after castles, for example, bishop to d7, white has a choice between either playing f3 and trying to launch kingside attack, as I did in the Blitzfield Invitational game, or the more positional approach with f4 intending to play f5 and break down black's pawn structure substantially after moves like, for example, rook c8 is one main line, knight f3, b5. Eventually, white will capture on f6 at a moment where black is forced to capture back with the pawn, and then play f5, hoping for e5, in which case white will have a very beautiful outpost in the d5 square. But if black doesn't play e5, which he shouldn't, then these pawns will become very, very weak, and black would need to seek compensation through active play because the king has no home, the pawns are weak, and the development is a little bit difficult to complete. But again, you know, these lines have never been refuted. Black is considered to be very much alive and kicking in these lines, and it's particularly good for playing for a win because there's no way to force a draw as white, or no easy way to force a draw as white. You pretty much do keep a lot of the pieces on the board. Black always has the opportunity to play for a queenside attack, even though the structure looks... Well, in fact, black is obligated to play for a queenside attack because normal means are not going to suffice in such a position. And so black actually does win a lot of games. It's kind of a position where, like, white is probably supposed to win most of the time in practical terms, but they have to be very careful along the way. So it's kind of it's like a skill check kind of opening in a way. Like, if your opponent does everything right, they're going to win without too much trouble. But if they make a mistake, suddenly they fall under a serious attack and they can lose very, very quickly. But in this game, my opponent chose a very, very old response to the classical Sicilian, which is to just play bishop e2. So white is not really looking for any kind of advantage here. Black will be fine through any number of ways. But white is developing very quickly, does not intend to go to the queen side with the king, where some of the lines can get very crazy. Both sides are going to be attacking on opposite wings. And instead goes for a more modest position, just setting up a safe development, not really allowing any immediate confrontation in the opening, and just trying to get a position where maybe white can even be slightly more preferable because of the additional space. So after bishop e2, black should challenge the center immediately with the move e5. And in this game, my opponent played knight to f3, which is the main continuation after bishop to e2. Knight b3 is, I think, less accurate. It is played sometimes. I have had a game, a couple games actually, with the white pieces where I tried this move, knight to b3, including a game against very, very strong grandmaster Lequang Liem, where I got a pretty bad position with the white pieces out of the opening, but did manage to draw the game. So this is also a very solid option for white, but knight f3 is by far the main line. So you might wonder why we're going back to f3. It seems a bit weird to sort of have moved the knight into the center only to move it back. And it is a bit odd. You know, the knight doesn't really accomplish anything on f3. It's much more about the fact that the knight is even worse on b3 than it is on f3. Because, again, the knight is not doing anything. It is not really able to enter the game. And after some normal development, black often plays the move a5, trying to harass this knight even further. And it's very difficult for this knight to find a safe home on the queen side. It's probably going to end up getting forced back even further. And there aren't really clear routes for it back into the game once it gets pushed back that far. So to avoid this, white usually puts the knight on f3, where it is, for the moment, out of play, but it can return into the game through, you know, a maneuver to h5, perhaps through a maneuver to d3 after white has castled, perhaps going to c4. It does still have some scope. So in this game, I played the move h6. There are two main lines for black here. One is to play h6 to control the g5 square, which is a move that white would, in principle, very much like to play. The downside of the move e5, you know, on the one hand, we've staked some claim to the center, and we've gained time by harassing this knight back. But as is typical in the Sicilian, we've left a very, very big hole on the d5 square. And so white often organizes his play around trying to put a piece there. So if black continues normally with a move like bishop e7, intending castling, white has the additional option of playing bishop to g5, removing one of the defenders of the d5 square and preparing to bring a knight there. Bishop to g5 also gets a dark square bishop developed, which means that this knight on f3 actually has a route to the d5 square. A slow route, but a very powerful one if it gets there. And this is a very, I think, kind of uncomfortable position for black to play. It's very Sveshnikov-like. And black's counterplay is going to come very much in the same way as the Sveshnikov, trying to put like a bishop on g5, castle, put make some kind of pawn advance on the queen side to try to open things up. But it's a very, very pleasant position for white, and one that's almost impossible to lose in. So in this game, I chose to move h6, which is also a very big main line. Basically saying, okay, yes, this move is wasting a little bit of time, but you've already wasted some time yourself with the white pieces, so I can afford to take a little bit of time out of my day to secure the d5 square for, or at least some defense of the d5 square for myself. So white castles, and now black goes bishop e7, intending to castle now that h6 has been properly secured. White plays rook to e1. This move might be a little mystifying if you're seeing it for the first time, because, you know, what is the rook really doing on f1? Answer again, not much. White is much more, the move is much more aimed at bringing the bishop back to f1, because this light square bishop has really no role right now. Unless it goes to c4, which is possible, but it'll be vulnerable to harassment there by either a6 or b5, or knight a5, or both. This bishop is kind of in the way, and so white's plan in this position is generally going to be connected with putting a piece on d5 eventually, and then after black takes, to take back with the pawn. This is typical of like Najdorf type positions, but also some variants of the Sveshnikov. White will go ahead and allow, you know, the hole on d5 to be filled, but in exchange is going to get very, very strong queenside play, and the position takes on more of a King's Indian flavor at that point. And so you can kind of think of rook e1 as preparing for that eventuality. The rook right now is staring at a very, very closed e-file, but if white does play knight d5 eventually and take back with the pawn, then this file starts to become much more irrelevant. The other point of rook e1 is, again, the f1 square is also open for the knight, so there is a route for the knight in some lines, not typical, but it is a plan that white can pursue. And also it just lends more support to e4, which means that this knight has some options of where to go, including, again, d5. Like, you know, if white played knight d5, black would theoretically be able to take this pawn without the rook on e1. With the rook on e1, black is pretty much forced to take on d5 and allow the transformation of the structure. So just a generally useful move. It also defers the decision of how to develop the rest of the pieces for white, because it's not immediately clear where this bishop wants to go. It could go to e3, which is probably going to be its main square, but it's not clear that it's any better on e3 than it is on c1, at least at the moment. So stalling the decision a little bit makes sense as well. Black continues with castles, you know, what else? White plays h3. This is sort of very similar to black's h6 idea. White doesn't want to allow bishop to g4 takes and securing a not quite as good outpost for the knight as d5 would be, but d4 is still definitely something for black to work with. And also this secures the e3 square for the bishop, because it won't be vulnerable to the knight coming to g4 and harassing it. Very similar to the Pirc variation that my opponent chose in game 1 of the same tournament. So in this position, black has two choices. Black can complete the development with, or continue the development with bishop to e6, intending d5, which is probably the main move. But in this game, I decided to play partially, or well, mostly as a means of trying to get my opponent more out of book, because at this point he was still playing extremely quickly. All of these moves have been blitzed out. Here I chose the second main line a6, intending to expand on the queen side with b5. Also a typical idea of the Sicilian in general. Often a6 is played already because it's you reach these sorts of positions for the knight dwarf, but b5 is a typical follow-up to get the b7 square for the bishop, where it will be very nicely posted on the long diagonal. Brandish the idea of playing b4, where it will force this knight to move away and undermine support of the e4 pawn. And so it's just a very generally useful move to play, in my opinion. My opponent did play bishop to f1, so the plan we had discussed. Now the rook at least has the job, and knight d5 becomes possible again. In particular, if black plays the move b5, which is the very natural follow-up, now knight d5 is very, very serious, because these pawns suddenly become kind of overextended once white commits to queenside play. The e4 pawn is defended, so black pretty much is obligated to take. And after takes, the knight doesn't have a particularly comfortable square to go to. For example, after knight to b8, which would be the typical reaction, intending to reroute to c5. But this move might look a little weird, again, undeveloping the knight, but generally speaking, this loss of time is fine. The position is very closed now after white recaptures, so both sides have time to pursue slower plans. And black's plan will eventually be to bring this knight to c5, play f5, e4, bishop f6, open long diagonal. In principle, this would be a very nice position for black, but after a4, since black has played b5, the queenside is collapsing sort of far quicker than usual, and black's kingside counterplay has not gotten started at all. It might even be more accurate for white to begin with a4, force b4, and then after takes, knight b8. Now this pawn is very, very weak, and white can even basically collect it immediately by playing a move like a5, preventing black playing a5 himself, and supporting this pawn is just going to be impossible. White can play bishop d2, can play rook a4 to increase the pressure, can play queen d2 as well, rook e4. The pawn will eventually be lost for not a whole lot of obvious compensation. Not fatal, necessarily, because again, black gets a lot of counterplay on the king side, but it is a very healthy pawn for white. So this bishop f1 move has the secondary purpose of essentially stopping the b5 plan immediately, and so black needs to prepare it a bit first before committing to it with the move queen to c7. This is generally the follow-up to a6, and now b5 is much less bad. Because first of all, there's another square for the knight, which is a little more healthy. After f5, it can join the king side. Second of all, the queen puts pressure along the c file. So, if for example, if white does nothing and we reach a similar line, now after takes, something like queen d2 is less dangerous, because if white ever moves the queen away to take the pawn, black is able to capture on c2 as well. And the queen on c7 is just a very well-placed piece. It gets out of the way of this rook, so bishop b7, rook c8 is possible. All in all, this basically, the queen c7 basically threatens, in a sense, or renews the threat of playing b5. Positionally. There aren't super concrete lines to speak of here. The position is very closed, very stable. But positionally, this prepares the very powerful thrust b5. So in this position, my opponent has a lot of options. The obvious moves have sort of been exhausted. All of the prophylactic moves, the development of the king side has been completed. And so white pretty much has to make a decision now, finally commit to a plan. And so the big choice is whether or not to play knight to d5. Which, in principle, should be the thing that white is playing for, and if white wants to win the game, this is something that white needs to do sooner or later. So after takes, knight to b8. Now the pawn is not on b5, so black's queenside is a bit more solid. And so after c4, black needs to find a fairly nice move, bishop to f5, to stay in the game, putting the bishop on a very nice diagonal. And after something like b3, let's say knight to d7, bishop b2, bishop slides back to h7 maybe, preparing f5. Taking control of the center. Black has a very, very comfortable game. This is the sort of position that I was hoping for when we entered this line, because again, knight d5 is the only serious winning try. And I did expect my opponent to very much try to beat me in this position. Well, in general. I mean, generally, with the white pieces, you're going to be trying to win, especially against an opening that's not particularly good. So this is the sort of opening that I was hoping for, where it's very, very double-edged. I think objectively this is probably about equal, but black's plan is very, very clear. White is not immediately obvious what white's plan is going to be. And if white does try to expand on the queen side in very King's Indian defense style, it takes a lot. Black is really loaded up on the c5 square, so getting in c5 for white is extremely difficult. I felt that this would be very, very comfortable, so I wasn't scared of an immediate knight d5. If white is not going to play knight d5, then bishop e3 is also very sensible, just trying to complete the development. The downside is that black has the option of playing knight a5 now, bringing the knight to c4, where it will harass the bishop that is now moved to e3. And so there are some lines I prepared here as well. White, typically, if white is playing bishop e3, white basically needs to know this move queen d2, which looks very strange visually. Black is planning to play knight c4 and try to trade off one of the bishops. You are now forcing, or not forcing, but like you're making it way more appealing for black to play knight c4, because now it is a fork in addition to attacking the dark square bishop. But it turns out black actually cannot do this immediately, because this piece sacrifice is very, very powerful. And even though there's no immediate threat, white will simply play rook e3, rook g3, move the knight, and then play rook g3. And black has no adequate defense, it turns out, to handle this line. So black actually does need to deal with this threat, and this gives white enough time to sort of justify the position of the bishop on e3. White is maybe even a little bit better here, though in practice, black draws pretty much every game. But my opponent spent some time here. I'm not sure if this was over the board inspiration or if this was something he knew. But he came up with a almost novelty, almost never been seen before, only 2 or 3 games in history. But the computer finds that it is the best move in this position, which is the very, very subtle, simple waiting move a3. Now, at first glance, it's really not clear what this move does, and in the game I was very confused by it. But it does have some immediate purposes. Black's plan, as we discussed, is to play b5, where b4 will be a threat, trying to undermine support of the e4 pawn. So a3 does prevent the b4 part of that, at least. Black can still play b5, but it at least prevents black from going to b4. And black is stuck between 2 plans. One is to play knight a5, knight c4, which makes much less sense if the bishop is on c1, because then the knight on c4 doesn't actually do anything. And playing the move b5, bishop e7 is the other plan. So by playing a3, white is basically forcing black to commit to one of those. White has to now make a decision. And we've already used our waiting moves. So in a way, a3 is trying to cause like a weird kind of zugzwang, where neither, both of these plans, b5 and bishop b7, or knight a5 and knight c4, is good depending on what white does. Knight a5 is good against bishop e3, b5 is good against, I don't know, some other moves, like some other, just like completely random moves. Sort of anything slower, king h2, bishop d3, whatever, just like any slow move. So by playing a3, white basically forces black to show his hand, and then white will play whichever one, or white will follow whichever plan like black didn't prepare to counter. And so it's actually a very, very interesting idea. I didn't really understand it or fully appreciate it during the game. And so I just continued with the move b5, which seemed very sensible. Even though we're not threatening b4, we open up the square for the bishop, It's just a very logical way to follow up, but it gives my opponent the opportunity now to play the move bishop e3, now that black has committed to b5. So I tried knight a5 nonetheless, sort of the same idea as usual, bring the knight to c4. But again, I wasn't sure how the inclusion of a3 and b5 affected things, because it's actually very interesting. to compare the position with a3 and b5 and without a3 and b5. It's not obvious what the difference should be, or really if there should be a difference. So if white does play queen d2, I spent quite a lot of time here trying to figure out, okay, does the piece sacrifice now work, or does it not work? So after knight c4, bishop takes. Let's say we take with the queen. Then after takes on h6, takes, we reach basically the same position as the original piece sacrifice after the immediate bishop e3. And so the question is, okay, can black defend now? Or has the inclusion of a3 and b5 changed anything? And the answer really shouldn't be yes. I didn't really see too many concrete lines here, but in general, like, it's not really clear what this should change, all of the play is on the king side, so the queen side play should be irrelevant. And so I didn't think this gave me any more options. And so even though I wasn't 100% sure, like, why this is losing, I just knew that it was losing after bishop e3 and queen d2 normally. So I wasn't sure what black's defense is even supposed to be to, like, try to survive the position. But I couldn't see how, like, b5 would help. So I just assumed that this would be losing as well. The other difference is that we can take with the pawn here. And so I spent some time trying to decide, okay, if I take with the pawn, now how does the situation look if white goes ahead and sacrifices a piece? Is this any different? Now the queen is on c7, maybe that offers more defensive possibilities than if the queen is drawn to c4. And eventually I decided that the answer to that is actually probably yes. That is a difference. If the queen is on c4, then, after queen h6, black's most natural defense is to move knight h7, whether the queen is on c7 or c4. And the problem with it when the queen is on c4 is that after knight d5, bishop moves, this queen is completely stranded and not able to rejoin the defense at all. We would like to be able to play queen e6, hopping over the knight, but unfortunately, the rules of chess do not permit that. But with the queen on c7, I thought that knight h7 here would be more playable. Because now after knight d5, we can go queen to d7, and white is not quite in time, I thought, to play rook e3, because after simple move like king h8, intending bishop d8 and queen e6, it seems like black is holding everything together. Barely, but I thought that black was holding everything together. Maybe bishop d8 first is... Well, actually bishop d8 first, knight takes e5 is the problem with mate coming. So king h8 actually is necessary first. So this gave me some confidence in playing knight a5, knowing that queen d2 was probably less scary. Like, playing b5 has actually done something to prevent queen d2 a little bit. And so I was not surprised to see my opponent choose a different move, which was the interesting move, knight to h4. I'm not sure if this move is the best, but it seemed very sensible. Just trying to bring the knight to f5 at some moment, open up a square for the queen, play, eventually for some combination of knight f5 and knight d5 made a lot of sense to me. So knight h4 was played. I very quickly put knight c4 because, what else? We have to continue our plan. My opponent dropped the bishop back to c1. So white has given, 2 more moves. White already wasted some time in the opening, moving the knight to d4 and then back. Now white has wasted 2 more moves as well. But the position is still very, very solid. White has no weaknesses in the position. It's not really clear what black's plan is. We would like to be able to play for d5, but it's very, very slow. And so in this position, I felt like I had equalized at least because, white has basically done nothing for the entire game. But I was also starting to get a little concerned because at this point, I thought it was very clear that white was not trying to win the game. Which means that this opening was kind of the wrong choice. As we talked about at the beginning of this game and the opening choice in game 1, generally if your opponent is not trying to win the game, you actually would prefer to play the main lines. Because this will cause them to try to deviate into something safer, and you'll just get a better position that way. Like, you're not the one that has to deviate. But if your opponent's not trying to win the game and you play like these offbeat lines, these offbeat openings, not that the classical Sicilian is like that bad or anything. I mean, it's a very, very playable opening. But if your opponent is not trying to win the game against the classical Sicilian, you don't have a lot of options to sort of spice up the game yourself. And so at this point, I was actually like a little bit miserable because I really didn't see how I was going to win this position or try to even create like any kind of complications. I'm very reliant on my opponent trying to do something, and so if he just continued his plan of doing nothing, I was a little concerned about how I would manage to win this game, which was magnified by the fact that my looking over at my teammates, my board 2 was already in severe trouble right out of the opening, basically losing with the white pieces on move like 8. So that was a very unfortunate match situation to be in, as the other two boards were still very unclear. So it wasn't clear how we were, what our route was to win this match. And so I continued with the only plan that, seemed reasonable, which was to try to play for d5, starting with the move bishop to e6, intending, very slowly to play rook d8 and d5. But it's very, very slow. My opponent played the move queen to f3, which is very sensible, preparing knight f5, just getting the queen off of the d-file in case d5 does ever occur. And here I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to complicate the game, because at this moment I realized it was very likely that my opponent was intending to just, repeat, basically. The main move that I had considered up until this point was the move queen c8, trying to keep control of the f5 square. You might wonder why not queen d7 with the same idea, but keeping the queen on a more active square. Here I was concerned about a4, forcing b4, and then knight d5, opening up an attack on the knight. So I wanted to keep the queen on c8 so that the knight would stay defended. But probably both moves are fine and objectively correct. But after queen c8, I was concerned about the move queen g3, threatening bishop h6. This pretty much forces king h7, and then I was concerned about what happened if white played for a simple move like queen d3, trying to open up an attack on this diagonal and prepare the move knight d5 in particular. And one of the problems that I saw here was that black would like to play the move g6 to try to block up this diagonal, but after b3, knight b6, queen e3, there's a double attack on the h6 square, threatening not quite mate, but very close to it, and this undefended knight on b6. It's not fatal, because this is not yet a serious attack. If white takes on b6, we'll be able to take on c3. But I thought that this was very uncomfortable for black after knight g8, only defense, just knight f3, stepping away from the attack. These threats are still very much in the air. I thought white had a very, very pleasant position here. So instead, after queen d3, I probably have to play the move king back to g8. It's black's best move, just getting off of the diagonal. And then I thought it was very likely my opponent would actually just repeat the position and force an immediate draw. I don't know if that's what he was intending or not, but it was certainly, it was an option I didn't want to give my opponent. So if queen c8 allows my opponent to force a draw, queen d7 looks bad because, first of all, white can force the same draw if he wants to, but second of all, a4 and knight d5 looks very concerning. Not really obvious what else black's plan can possibly be. There's just not a lot else to even hope for. If black tries the very direct rook d8, intending d5, then after knight f5, black is not able to play bishop f8, which would be normally a very solid response to knight f5, because there are tactics immediately with the hanging f6 knight. If this knight were somewhere else, like on d7 already, then this would be very possible. And if after, rook d8, knight f5, d5, we do accomplish our goal technically, but black is not likely to survive this. White is going to get, at the very least, white will get the two bishops in a very comfortable way. There's already threats of taking on h6. This knight is going to be either captured or kicked, which means that the e5 pawn will fall. The opening of the center is not favorable to black here, even though that is the plan we have been playing for. We're just not able to do it immediately because of the activity of the pieces. So I was at a kind of a loss to come up with an idea that didn't allow a draw immediately, and eventually, after spending quite a lot of time, I think I spent like 20-30 minutes here, I played the only other idea I could come up with that made things even remotely complicated, which was this very odd-looking move knight to h7. And the idea of this move is very simply to play bishop g5, try to trade off this bishop, and argue that the queen side has been weakened by the removal of the defender. But there's a lot of downsides to this plan. Some, I knew during the game this was objectively very, very bad, but I was hoping that it wouldn't be that bad. On the one hand, first of all, we're getting rid of our defender of some very critical squares. It makes our king very, very weak because we lose what is not just one of, but probably our best defensive piece. It makes a d6 pawn very, very weak and very difficult to control. And we're also moving away from the center. We've relinquished all pressure ever on either of these central squares, e4 or d5, which makes it very, very possible for white to bring the knight into d5 at some moment. This knight is completely out of play, and it has no route back into the game. Even if it does go to g5, it's not like it has anywhere to go from there. It's probably just going to have to go back, and then to f6 if it wants to rejoin the game. So overall, not a very good move, but one that I hoped would at least inspire some confusion. My opponent played knight f5, bishop g5, and continued the plan. My opponent took on c4, which makes sense, trying to prevent any pressure on b2. And here, black has a choice of how to recapture, but if I'm playing for a win, which I am, the pawn is the only real option, trying to open the b file and generate pressure on b2. Again, we're going to remove the defender of this pawn, so in principle it's very sensible to try to open the b file, put pressure on b2. My opponent took... I actually didn't... I was told after the game that my opponent actually offered a draw in this position, which is a little egregious because white is very, very close to winning. But sort of indicates that I was correct in my assessment that my opponent was probably going to just try to make a draw in this game. I probably would have accepted the repetition earlier. But I didn't actually hear him offer the draw in this position, which I might have actually accepted. Probably not, honestly, because, if we come this far, we're kind of committed, but I would have had to seriously consider it because this position is already getting... even though this is, sort of what we wanted, this is just not a good position for black. So I took with the knight, queen g4 was played, which is a nice move. A bit unintuitive to put the queen sort of, or sort of create your own pin, pinning the knight to the queen, but black can't ever play g6 because of knight takes h6 comes with check. And then this knight is falling, so it's a perfectly fine square to go to. And it keeps control over... It has some other useful properties, as we'll see. I played the move queen b7, trying to put pressure on b2. But after h4, black is forced to take. The knight cannot move because of checkmate on g7. So after takes, now the point of the queen being on g4 is revealed, where it's hitting this c4 pawn. Whereas on g3, it wouldn't have... It would still be fine where it is, but it wouldn't have quite the same role. So I played the knight back to h7, only square. My opponent took on c4, I took on b2, and here my opponent found a very powerful move, which I had missed during my initial calculation of knight h7. I had mostly looked at moves like rook b1 here, trying to trap the queen, which is unsuccessful. The queen manages to worm its way out. I looked at knight e4, which seems very sensible, trying to put pressure on d6 while also defending the c2 pawn. But my opponent found a better version of this knight e4 idea, which was to play the move knight to d5. And here I realized that black is actually in massive trouble. The rook cannot come to c8 because there's knight e7 check, picking it up, forking the king and the rook. For similar reasons, we're never able to put like the queen on c6 or really develop the pieces at all. It's not really clear how black even tries to untangle. And if black tries to challenge this knight immediately with knight f6, then after takes, rook b1, the queen actually is trapped. In a sense, it has to go to d4, and this endgame is completely lost for black. The pawn structure is completely decimated, and they will they will fall one by one very quickly. Plus, to add insult to injury, white's rooks are actually more active than their counterparts. So in this position, black is in deep, deep trouble. I think the only real defense is to play queen b8, trying to go to d8 and to control the e7 square, which at least allows rook c8 and the activation of the rooks. But I missed that. I didn't immediately see that idea. Or I didn't see the strength of that idea. I had another idea in mind. Trying to activate the queen in a different way, which was to move queen to b5, offering an exchange of queens. Now, in this position, white has a pleasant choice. White can go for this endgame, which very likely white is simply going to win a pawn. After, for example, knight to c3, it's not really clear how this pawn gets defended. Rook a5, a4 continues to exploit the pin. b4 is forced, and after knight b5, cutting off the rook from the pawn, white is simply winning a pawn. Black can probably hold the endgame, because the passed pawn is very well blockaded, the structure on the king side is a little bit compromised, but white is pressing with no risk, for sure. So this is a very pleasant option, just going into a pawn up rook endgame. I was actually intending here to play knight f6, giving away this pawn and trying to hold this endgame, which I thought, to be fair, black should have very, very good chances to hold. But white can also play the move queen to e4, and then just keeping the queens on the board, arguing, you know, why should I trade queens? Your pieces suck, mine are good. Here I was intending to move queen to c5, which is a very nice square for the queen, but it's still very, very difficult to activate the rooks. And white has a pleasant choice of how to continue. There's sort of any number of ways. White could play rook e3 to g3, try to generate an attack. White could just put a rook on b1, try to play for rook b7, which looks very concerning. In particular, after rook b1, what black would like to play knight f6, exchange the knights, and it looks like this king is actually kind of safe. If check, we just go to h7. But here, after rook b7, this opens up a very subtle threat of queen g6, taking advantage of the pin along the 7th rank, and black has just no way to stop it. Queen g6 is coming, every one of the kingside pawns is going to fall, and this rook will enter the attack with pretty devastating effect. So after queen e4, not really clear what black does, to be honest. I think black is in deep trouble. Again, we can't play queen d7 to try to control the e7 square because there's another fork in the position. We can't go to e8 to try to defend the e7 square because there's another fork in the position. Black is very, very hard-pressed to defend either the endgame or the position after queen e4. And so in this position, I came up with my last trick, basically, before trying to defend a miserable position. And in this position, I offered a draw, which my opponent, fortunately for me, almost immediately accepted. And we escaped a probably very close to losing, if not losing. We can check what the objective evaluation here is. I suspect it's probably close to plus 1.5, plus 2. Okay, not quite as bad as I thought, though it is. Okay, not so bad, at least according to this engine. When I checked it with another engine, it seemed very, very bad. The actual offline engines were giving a much higher eval than this. But apparently after queen e4, okay, we can play queen b8, correct the mistake, and it seems to be survivable. But still a very, very convincing advantage for white. I'm actually very surprised that the evaluation is not as high as it was. Not really sure why it's lower on this engine, but okay. I mean, in any case, a bit of a nice escape for us to get away with just offering a draw here, and we did at least pick up a half point for our team. Unfortunately, this would turn out to be irrelevant. Our board 2 did in fact lose his game after a disastrous opening. Our third board also ended up losing a very, very difficult position as well. So the half point didn't bring us much reprieve. We ended up losing the match even without the results of our board 4, who eventually had a winning endgame, but didn't really press it particularly hard because the match was already over and ended up wandering into a draw towards the end. So by a score of 3-1, we ended up losing this match, which certainly ended any hope of finishing in the anywhere near the top places. At this point, we were playing more for top like 50 than top 5. But there was one more round left still. Obviously, no reason not to play. We're already there. And so even though we knew we were going to be playing, we were going to get a very large mismatch similar to round 3 or maybe closer to round 4. We did still want to finish strong, and I in particular with my individual 4.5 out of 5, which was just like kind of at this point now, this was a big blow to how good a tournament it was. 4-0 is obviously very good. 4.5 out of 5 is like, it's fine. It's not particularly good, considering the large number of mismatches that there were, at least on paper. But it was a fine result, at least going into the final round, and so I was hoping to make it 5.5, which is kind of the minimum acceptable score. I talked about in round 1, when you allocate this much rating to your board 1 in a team event, you really are expecting them to make at least 5.5. More ideally 6, but at least 5.5. So I wanted to at least meet that bar, and I knew that there would be a good chance to do it. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all for the 6th and final round.